Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Archishman Chaudhuri and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Indian Ocean World Center, McGill University. Our podcast for today features two guests. I have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Chandni Singh, a research consultant at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, Bangalore, India, where she researches on issues of climate change adaptation, differential vulnerability and well-being, disaster risk, and rural-urban migration. Dr. Singh has authored reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and she has widely published on climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, natural resource management, climate information services, livelihood transformations, and human migration. Joining Dr. Singh is our second guest for the day, Professor Roger Few of the University of East Anglia. Broadly speaking, Professor Roger Few's research lies at the confluence between research in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, with links to themes of livelihoods or well-being, especially in lower income settings, environmental health, water security, and social justice, on which he has a prolific number of publications. Of late, Professor Few's research has increasingly focused upon studying long-term processes of recovery from extreme events. He's involved in various research projects across South America, the Caribbean islands, East Africa, and India. Today, Dr. Chandni Singh and Professor Roger Few will tell us about their collaborative research project based in India, which is entitled Recovery with Dignity. So, without much further ado, Dr. Singh and Professor Few, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
So, could I just ask you a number of questions to start off the podcast? Would you please tell us what is this project about? What does recovery with dignity mean, and how would it be different from other recovery projects after disasters?
Okay, well, perhaps I can start. The idea behind the project really stemmed from the recognition, certainly the recognition that we feel is that disaster recovery is an aspect of disaster risk and disaster risk research, which hasn't really had that same degree of critical research that other aspects have. So, for example, around issues around perhaps preparedness and mitigation. And our contention is that recovery is often perhaps thought about as it's just a sort of an extension of getting things back to normal, and not enough critical thought going into understanding how the actual needs of the people affected by disasters change, and actually the dynamics that happen over time. So we're particularly interested in the long-term period. So we kind of pick up at the point where relief efforts and so on have started to sort of shift. And perhaps some of the attention to the disaster impacts in the media and in society have started to reduce the sort of immediate, and because the tangibility of the event is no longer there, let's say, for the wider population. But our own experience of research is that for the population affected, of course, it is very tangible. Those that survive, and particularly the poorest and more marginalized in society, face enormous challenges in rebuilding their livelihoods, but more than just their livelihoods, in rebuilding their well-being. And so some of these ideas sort of coalesced, and there was an opportunity to do some research that was also sort of linked into, I guess, more into the humanities, to enable disaster-affected people to voice their own needs, but also be respected for the situation they're in. So another thing that we've observed in other situations is as time passes, the positive sort of cohesive forces in society that happen, that tend to coalesce after a disaster when there's a lot of care and attention to those affected, they begin to dwindle. And people who are most affected and who continue to need the most support sometimes tend to be viewed in a negative way. That over time, there becomes the sort of patience, I suppose, of people and this idea that they are continuing to deserve support from the rest of society starts to dwindle. But another factor within all this is the recognition that after a disaster happens, most of the recovery activity that takes place is undertaken by the people themselves. And particularly in situations where people don't have much resources, they often club together locally with their kinfolk. But rather than it being something that's completely dependent on outside support, the most recovery activity is done by people themselves. But of course, if you're in a resource poor situation, you do need support. And it's recognizing that capacity and agency of people. So the project was trying to sort of capture a lot of these different elements. And so together with IIHS, UEA, the team, some of us had worked together on previous projects, and we came together and decided to focus on the 3 states in India. And I'll maybe pass over to Chandni now to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So just to backtrack a bit, I think just to mention that this project was funded by the British Academy, and there was an explicit focus on, of course, the most vulnerable, but also this idea of bringing in the social sciences and the humanities in particular to think about some of these challenges. So we had quite a focus on not only people like us who do work on vulnerability, climate change and disaster risk, but also bringing in filmmakers and people who work in the humanities to think about some of these aspects of how people recover from disasters, how do they portray their own needs. Coming to the geographical location of this project, I guess we started out by building on previous work that we've done in 2 Indian states, Odisha and Tamil Nadu. And in both these states, we've done a lot of research and some kind of implementation actually in Odisha also and Tamil Nadu around disaster recovery and inclusive recovery really. And while we were writing up the proposal, there was also this whole recurrent floods that took place back to back 2 years in a row in Kerala. And then we realized that there's a need there also to talk about how, as a disaster is taking place, how are people recovering and trying to understand that. So that's how we ended up with these 3 states, Odisha, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. And really, I think focusing on the most marginal people affected in these states.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, and thank you, Professor Few. If I might just build upon that, you're talking about 3 different states, although all of them are located close to the sea, and if I'm not wrong, a significant portion of the economic infrastructure is dependent upon livelihood that stems from the sea. What are the challenges that you see in terms of recovery process, particularly with regard to infrastructural development, or how communities respond to disasters in these 3 different states of India?
Yeah, so I think I'll focus on some of our experiences in Tamil Nadu. That's the region I'm most familiar with. And I think given the long history of disasters in Tamil Nadu, it's an interesting case to talk about. So, of course, as you say, it has a long coastline. and livelihoods are dependent on being at the coast. Fishing is a very significant livelihood there, as well as other infrastructure along the coast, tourism, for example. But as we know, Tamil Nadu faces a lot of, recurrent cyclones, which are increasing in frequency and also intensity. But it's important to understand that the nature of risk is not something that's new out there. There are communities living along the coast who have always dealt with risk. It's perhaps the nature of that risk that's changing, and also, of course, the kind of development that's taking place. So you've got Chennai, the capital of Tamil Nadu, which is expanding rapidly and often in a way that's not very ecologically sensitive. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to highlight is that while there are these states and places that are coastal, and we tend to focus on fishing livelihoods, which are very tangible and apparent to you as soon as you visit some of these villages along the Tamil Nadu coast, there are also other livelihoods that are taking place. So in Nagapattinam district, which is where one of the places where we did our research, there are these vast salt pans where people, harvest the salt. That's one, which is a livelihood that's not spoken about much, but was also affected really strongly after the cyclone Gaja that happened in 2018. Then there's also the whole story of farming livelihoods along the coast, which doesn't get as much mention in disaster recovery. So if you look at some of the interventions that the state does, they're very focused on fishing livelihoods, which is understandable, but then some of these livelihoods get marginalized, like farming livelihoods, where because of a cyclone or because of just the seawater coming in, there's a lot of saltwater intrusion, and the groundwater is then salty, and then the farms are, it's very difficult to cultivate that land, and it takes many, many years to restore that land. So I think in this, what we've been seeing at least is that, yes, these states that we worked in, they are at risk because of their location. There is that understanding, and people have, dealt with that over generations. But increasingly that risk, I think the nature of the risk is changing a bit. And also there are some livelihoods that are not recognized as being as much at risk as perhaps fishing livelihoods.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. May I now probe you a little bit more on how people perceive long-term recovery, as you and Professor Roger Few have been talking about? How do they perceive long-term recovery from disasters? Is it tangible in the way they assert their grievances, or is it something that can be only expressed through different forms, like rebuilding shelters, or investing more and more in terms of sustainable environmental livelihood opportunities in areas that are prone to disasters?
Well, I think it's all of those things and more, and it will obviously vary from place to place. So along with issues around infrastructure and rebuilding livelihoods, one of the key things that we really want to emphasize through our research is recognition of these more these less tangible aspects of recovery, which are just as important in people's lives. So around rebuilding a sense of community if there's been a lot of sort of destruction, dealing with psychosocial aspects of recovery, not just in that sort of immediate kind of emergency mental health phase following a disaster, but over the long term, and recognizing how that itself has a dynamic. And for some people, the passage of recovery is not a gradual rebuilding. It itself is very uneven and sometimes deeply hit by other sort of problems. And so genuine attention to that aspect and supporting communities to be able to support each other as well, rebuilding social networks. All these things are mentioned, and I raise this because this is something that's also clear from work in other parts of the world. Not necessarily an easy thing to support, not necessarily an easy thing to get funding to support, because it's typically the focus, the economic sector focuses on rebuilding infrastructure and so on. But it is key, and recognizing that it is that specific and special consideration may be needed to just how the long-term impacts of a disaster play out in these social and psychological senses.
I think this idea of what recovery is and how is it understood by different people is one of the things that was at the core of this project. So we tried to explore that through various ways. We looked at policy documents to understand what does the state really say about recovery. And there is obviously an understanding over time when you look at the policy documents as well, that the idea of recovery as only infrastructure, where you're building houses and rebuilding roads, that has shifted to make it a little more inclusive, talking about building capacities of these affected communities through, setting up early warning systems, evacuation procedures, those kinds of things. And then there's also been a lot of funding and a lot of work, at least in Tamil Nadu and Orissa, about on rebuilding livelihoods, so strengthening livelihoods, a lot of focus on gender and women empowerment also through as a positive side effect of some of the recovery interventions. But then, so most of these things are typically tangible, measurable forms of recovery. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there's a reason why these modes of recovery are mentioned in policy documents, are funded by large funders working in the humanitarian sector. Now, when the other side of it was, we went around villages in Tamil Nadu talking about or conducting these workshops where we wanted to understand people's own idea of what recovery means to them. And there where we sat down and had these very interactive sessions, these group discussions, where we'd ask them to draw their idea of recovery. Of course, the house gets drawn first, and then you've got the road and the school, which is actually fitting with that state idea of recovery. But then you've got people drawing their community. You've got people drawing their temple, which in one case we had seen the whole temple roof had been blown off. And that's important because that's a community place where people come together. I think most of the people drew trees because trees are the things that get damaged in these very high-speed cyclones. So then you get a sense of, and then we actually asked people to talk about these pictures and tell us what they were trying to represent through those drawings. And you get a very different idea of recovery, which is often not captured in these interventions that are taking place. So I think one of our findings, or one of the things we want to showcase in this project, is really that there are multiple ideas of recovery, and how do we really bring them in when we're thinking about long-term interventions,
Thank you. Yes, and I do think, regardless of context, really, there are some sort of things that are close to being universal. And one is this fundamental recognition that the access to resources that you have, the assets you have, they don't just reshape your ability to get back to where you were. They make you much more susceptible to further shocks. They make it that much harder. If you have more resources, if you have, for example, some form of savings, you immediately have the possibility, tough though it is, to draw on something to restart that slow process. If you're in a situation where you're already living on the margins and you've lost the assets you have, you don't have that resource, even small though it may be, to make a start with again. You have to either use your ingenuity and whatever resources are available, but fundamentally, and in most of the contexts we're in, it does require, a consistent helping hand, much more than just relief. But it's a helping hand not to become a beneficiary. It's a helping hand to actually restart the agency that everybody has in life to rebuild their livelihoods. And I think this does apply. It applies in all contexts. And in all contexts, it's a struggle to be able to provide that support. Of course, there's not limitless finance, there's not limitless government capabilities out there. So but I think what we're kind of arguing for is a readiness and a recognition that it's not a kind of one size fits all type of approach, and it can't be. And in tandem with that is this phrase that we often hear when we're doing research with different people, which is, everybody was affected the same. It's not just that group, everyone was affected, or we're all in the same boat. And, to sort of paraphrase what somebody once said, well, they may be in a boat, but they're certainly not in my boat. It's clear that everybody's not affected the same. They may, in a very sort of immediate physical sense, yes, you may lose. Let's just focus on damage to property. Let's say you may lose you may lose your roof of an expensive house, or you may lose your roof on a poorer dwelling. If you lose the roof on the poorer dwelling in this sort of situation, probably there'll be structural damage throughout the whole dwelling, and it will collapse. So the whole thing's gone. And then where do you get the resources to rebuild? If you have a house and the damage is there, there's probably a fair chance that you can access a loan, or you have the collateral to be able to do that, to rebuild. So it all starts at such a different way, and to just see as everybody is on the kind of the same slope of recovery is just doesn't match the reality, really.
Just to add something to that, actually, what we often see when you all the things that Roger said, these ideas about what a disaster does to people, where do we get that information? If you're a layperson, where do you get these ideas from? It's typically media reports. You might see something, and from the media review that we did, so we looked at international and local reporting on disasters. You tend to see that disaster impacts are often spoken of course, right after the disaster. So that's one thing, that immediate reporting. And then when you look at recovery, it kind of tapers off. So there's no long-term reporting. The second thing really is impacts are discussed in aggregate and in tangible forms. So 3,000 people lost their lives, 2,000 houses were destroyed. And so again, there's that focus on tangible things and aggregate numbers. And that's where I think what Roger was mentioning, these more differentiated impacts get lost. So who were those 3,000 people? Are they impacted similarly? That kind of narrative just gets lost out. So I feel so that I think it's something, it's not only understanding what's happening on the ground, but then also the reportage that goes around it to then shape broader narratives around disaster impacts that really, we're finding and needs to be questioned.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. If I may ask you a question on this, do you feel there has been a change in terms of voicing of grievances by different groups after disasters over the past 20 odd years or so across Orissa and Tamil Nadu, where you have conducted research?
I think in some ways, the way disasters are spoken about and how people talk about their needs and their priorities, there has been an opening up of that discussion in some ways. If you think about the tsunami in 2004 to present day Tamil Nadu and Orissa, I think there has been a change where there are more voices being heard. They're not always, I think, given the same value. So each actor in this whole space of disaster recovery, some people are heard more and some people are heard less, but there has been an opening out. And I think there is a broader discussion in India and definitely in these states around both disaster impacts, preparing for disasters, and then recovery, long-term recovery. But what tends to happen is whose voice is loudest. And that was something we were trying to also explore, that which voices are included when you talk about recovery and which aren't. Of course, there's the formal voice of the state, and that, of course, is loud. And I personally believe that the state also is caught in its own priorities and constraints. So they do what they can given the situation, given the finances they have. So there's that voice around recovery, which is really important. But coming more specifically to your question around grievances and airing those, from our work, we've seen there are multiple ways people do that. In Orissa, we did an analysis of legal claims that are made. So cases that are filed by people or groups of people to sort of say, talk about their dissatisfaction with some of the recovery measures. For example, the houses they were allotted, or the houses they were allotted, and all of that. So that's one kind of mechanism to really air your grievances. The other thing we saw in Tamil Nadu, especially after Cyclone Gaja 2018-19, was people formed, they sort of leveraged their political and social networks. So they would go to their local representatives, go to tribal leaders, and put forth their demands. But all of this, again, often tends to be focused on the relief phase when there's a lot of attention and there is some amount of funding, versus the recovery phase where it takes a lot of sustained action to put that pressure and actually get the kinds of measures you want. In Chennai, there are some really active civil society groups that form kind of brokers. They talk on behalf of the community, but they are trying to bring that voice of the community really to the state. So there are all these actors in this place. You've got the community trying to, through legal claims, through grievance redressal mechanisms. There are these formal mechanisms as well that each recovery project typically has doing that. You've got these brokers in the middle trying to bridge the connection between the state and the community or people. And then you've got the state, of course, trying to listen, but in most cases failing to accurately capture what people need. Yeah.
I think in a sort of global sense, and this is really sort of my perception rather than something necessarily hard borne out by systematic evidence, but there is a global movement towards disaster risk reduction, which recognizes that disasters are fundamentally socially generated, at least as much as they are the result of physical hazards. And that sort of thinking obviously has become embedded in research, and it's become embedded in the international architecture and the national level in governments, at least in policies and strategies. And to some extent, I think that is filtering through, and through advocacy work, giving people the let's say the recognition of their rights, and the recognition of that their concerns about that these things aren't purely natural are valid. So I think to some extent it is happening, but we can see there's still these very sort of conservative prevailing forces, views around disaster risk and about what one should do about it. And obviously those are also linked to ideas about the role of the states, and whether it's a bigger role of the state and a lesser role of the state, and external intervention. And I think it is particularly still heightened within recovery field, and that's what we've been trying to say. But fundamentally, I always believe people know these things. People know where there's injustices, and they know what's right and what's not right in terms of their situation. But yeah, in the past, it's generally been the case that there aren't so many mechanisms through which to be able to express it. It is changing. I mean, one thing that we haven't really looked at properly within the project, I would say, is the role of social media and how that's influencing things. And it would be interesting to look at that, but also critically. I think sometimes one can get carried away with the role of social media. And in fact, as we've seen recently in international politics, not always a force for good. So I think, there's some aspects like that, but I guess the point is still people do still face prevailing prejudices and biases and structural barriers, of course, to achieving a voice.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, and thank you, Professor Few. If I might just probe you a little bit more in terms of policy issues, particularly with regard to planning. You have been talking about Chennai, which is so close to the sea, and so are two other major metro cities in India. For instance, Mumbai and Kolkata, and all of these have a common problem where the urban conglomerations keep on expanding, real estate keeps on encroaching upon mangroves and wetlands. I feel this is a theme common to all these three major cities. So, as policy researchers or policy planners, what would be your recommendations in order to plan better so that there is even recovery in more tangible and concrete environmentally sustainable terms in the case of a disaster?
Yeah, these are, I think, very pressing issues that are facing so many Indian cities, not only coastal. In the coasts, it's perhaps more apparent because of the floods that one sees, the cyclones and all of that. But then you've got your inland cities, which are facing water scarcity and drought. So it's really this tug of war between how much of your environment do you save and how do you really develop sustainably, urbanize sustainably. I think it's a challenge that various Indian cities, as you say, are facing. So if you look at Chennai, 2015 is when there was excessive rain and the floods happened, and there are, of course, it started off as being spoken about as a 1 in 100 years rain event, and just something that was a natural hazard that was so difficult to even prepare for, even estimate happening ever, forecast. And then slowly the conversation, I mean, many people said it's not only that, Chennai has built over all its water bodies and wetlands, and there's a reason why the flood became a disaster the way it did, the way so much of Chennai was flooded. What is interesting to see is that, so 2015, the floods happened. Chennai did not have a comprehensive disaster management plan at that time. And it was only after a lot of public pressure, a lot of very powerful people talking about just being so horrified that their city, this capital city of Tamil Nadu, this metropolitan of India, was affected so badly. And there was a lot of public pressure and recognition from the government. And all of that came together in 2017 when then Chennai launched its disaster management plan. When you actually go into that plan, you realize a lot of the conversation or the kinds of interventions that are spoken about are still really reactive. It's very much about when a flood happens, this is what we're going to do, but not proactive, not looking at how do we develop as a city, really questioning how do we develop as a city and change our city development plan, urban development plans to sort of preserve some of our wetlands, to make sure that we are not, again, building on our river banks and all these things. And many people have written about this in the context of Chennai, but also Bombay and Calcutta. I guess so. One of the things that our research argues for, and I think is relevant in these coastal cities, but also other disaster-prone situations, is, first of all, the way you measure and count vulnerability, the way you really assess who's vulnerable, which places in a city are vulnerable, or even rural areas, which villages, has to be more inclusive, has to be more dynamic. You can't have these assessments of physical vulnerability. So right now, when you look at the Chennai disaster management plan, it talks of flooding at 2 feet and flooding at 5 feet, and those are the areas that are vulnerable to flooding. But as we know, as Roger was mentioning earlier in our conversation, at 2 feet, if you're in a mud house, it's very different, 2 feet of flooding in a mud house versus 5 feet of flooding. If you're in a high-rise building, it's a completely different experience of the disaster. So I think this understanding of only measuring physical vulnerability is a big drawback, and that should be something. There's a whole lot of research to show that we need to look at more temporal vulnerability, how it changes over time, how it's socially differentiated. So that's I think one recommendation, that how we assess and think about vulnerability and risk needs to change. And I think the second thing is really what we have been talking about today, is really reimagining recovery to mean much more than just, in the case of Chennai, for example, relocating people from the riverbanks to other areas. That isn't inclusive recovery at all when you're moving people into flood-prone areas again. So I think reimagining what recovery means, and this sounds strange, but like democratizing the idea of recovery. So bringing in people's voices to really think about what recovery means to them is something that, this project, and also generally we have, not only us, I think other researchers in the space also have been arguing for.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Referring back to your brief discussion about memorialization, which both you and Professor Few have pointed out, how much is memorialization of a disaster part of a school curriculum? And here I have in mind school curriculums in Japan, where there is an extensive training towards disaster education, especially regarding earthquakes. Do you come across anything of that sort in the Indian states where you have researched, or even Professor Few, or for the areas that you have conducted research on?
I think there's probably more about the potential than the actuality of what's going on. I think work in schools obviously has it can play a key role, and I personally think it is important, particularly in places which are particularly hazard prone. So where there's a some sort of history, recognizing, of course, that things may change through climate change adaptation. But I think using schools to sort of change the mentality around, well, particularly I guess around forward planning, where that is possible, and I'm talking about this in all levels, to build in this idea that these are problems that we can, with sufficient will, we can manage. They're not simply things, these hazards, disasters are not handed down on us. They are a product of decisions that are made. And I think so that there's in that sense, of course, in that kind of more holistic sense, I'm aware of projects around the world which have focused on schools, some perhaps less much in terms of the curriculum, but more in terms of the schools being a locus for emergencies, emergency shelter, and so on, and building in that capacity. So it's hard to make any sort of judgment myself about curriculum development. What I could suggest is that recovery, if there is this curriculum, I don't think recovery will be a large aspect in it, because it hasn't really been talked about in quite that same integrated way as other aspects of risk.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chandni Singh and Professor Roger Few, for this wonderful conversation. We learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners are going to love this podcast. That's all we have got time for today. And thank you so much also to my colleague, Renee Mandeville, who worked behind the scenes and produced this podcast. And my name is Archishman Chaudhuri. You have been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.